Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're very pleased to have with us tonight Jacques Garnier, whose work is currently on view in the museum in the beautiful exhibition Hymns to the Silence. The exhibition has been extended through October of this year, so I very much hope that you'll have a chance to come and see it. Enjoy tonight's lecture.
Well, thank you, Marinta, for that wonderful introduction. And just a shout out to the museum, to Malcolm Warner, to Janet Blake, the curator, to Tim Schwab, and all the wonderful people who've really helped me through the exhibition and putting the catalog together. Thank you. The creation of artwork is driven by ideas. In the case of this series, Hymns to the Silence, the desire to create photographic abstractions, images that are reduced, stripped of the superfluous, and often even of context. Hymns to the Silence uses architecture as a foundation to explore poetic minimalism and encourage a new way of seeing. I'd like to break down this presentation into three parts. Firstly, I'd like to trace the trajectory of the different bodies of work that I've created and how it leads directly to the work displayed here at the Laguna Art Museum. Secondly, I'd like to break down the thought processes that helped evolve this Hymns to the Silence series. And thirdly, I'd like to discuss individual pieces in the series. While talking about this new work, Hymns to the Silence, I thought that I might spend a few minutes tracing the journey that brought me to develop the series. Throughout my career, I have shot in color. I've always seen in color, dreamed in color. And although I appreciated black and white photography, and I collected black and white photography mostly, I never thought that I would creatively venture in that direction. But about 5 years ago, something changed, and I was pulled into the nuances of black and white photography, the shading, the mystery, but most importantly, the emotional qualities that it evoked. This piece is in homage to John Cage and is entitled Symphony in Three Movements, Symphonies in Silence, if you will. Anyway, as I started to purge into black and white, it occurred to me that color, in my view, was more suited to storytelling, and that black and white could more easily tug at your heartstrings while creating or suggesting an emotion. At the same time, I went into an emotional parallel journey of trying to understand my love of abstract expressionism. The silence and these works that were so far removed from the concrete. The silence and introspection of these works continued to inspire me. Up to this point, my photographic journey had carried me into some interesting directions, and upon reflection, seemed to be pushing me more towards abstracted work. But interestingly, my first major series involved people. And since then, this has happened rather subconsciously, almost all of my work involving buildings of one sort or another. This project, which was done in the early 2000s with my good friend and colleague, Doug McCullough, resulted in a book called On the Beach. And as with any series that I've done, it started with an idea that needed exploring or an interest that needed to be developed. In this case, Doug had been doing work with chaos theory, and we decided to go to the beach, set up a tent, share one camera, and take pictures of people who sample pictures of people who would come to the beach. Now, so many pictures of beach people have to do with the girls in bikinis or little babies and things like that. And we decided that we wanted to let the people pose themselves and do whatever it is they wanted. And we set up a project over 3 years of creating a cross sample of beach-going people. This was done on the West Coast and the East Coast. We tried to use humor in what we were doing and have people pose as naturally as humanly possible. This 3-year project ended up being shown at a museum in Florida, the Southwest Museum of Photography, which has 69 of the pieces in their permanent collection, and Laguna here in Los Angeles has 12 pieces in their permanent collection. With the second series, which was started in the mid-2000s and which was parallel with some of the other work I was doing, is called Second Chances. And again, the theory behind this, or the thought behind it, was an article I had read in the Los Angeles Times, which talked about these desert shanties in the Mojave Desert, which were being considered a blight by the people who lived there. And there were about 5,000 of these abandoned shacks. Well, it piqued my interest, so I started going out there. This desert landscape, although there's a surreal aspect to it, is very lonely, very stark, immensely hot during the summertime. And it begged the question as to why people would want to live here. And thus the title, Second Chances. It turns out that most of the people who had lived there had come there after World War I to, one, deal with tuberculosis issues that a lot of the military had. And there were homesteading goals that had been set up. People get a 5-acre piece of property for $200, but they had 5 years unto which they had to build some sort of structure. I think the minimum requirement was 12 feet by 12 feet. So my idea was to go out to this remote desert landscape and try to understand why people move there. I'm trying to also to juxtapose the desolate and extremely harsh environment, but the beautiful surrealness of the area, while trying to understand the mindset of the people who live in this difficult environment. The next project was called the Legacy Project, and this was a wonderful 15-year project started by two mentors of mine, Jerry Birchfield and Mark Chamberlain, with a couple other people, Douglas McCullough again, that I did the Beach Book with, and Rob Johnson and Clayton Spada. And we decided to do a 15-year documentary on the now shuttered El Toro Marine Base. So over the 15 years, our goal over these 15 years was to create a documentation of a 4,800 acre site that had over 1,800 structures on it, that was really famous as an air base because people went to and from wars here. But nobody knew in 2003 and 4 what was going to happen to this area. We knew it was going to be developed, but we didn't know what it was going to become. So the idea of creating this immense documentation that would be passed on to the public was of paramount importance. Over the period of the 15 years, we took almost 500,000 photographs. We had over 32 exhibitions worldwide, 3 books, and the crowning blow was that the University of California, Irvine is archiving all the work. Notice that these two pictures that I've shown you from this series, that the use of perspective being pulled into the shot. This pattern you will notice will be repeated throughout the Hymns to the Silence that we will be showing in a while. One of the projects that of the many projects that we did with the Legacy Project was to create the world's largest photograph. And what we did was to turn a jet hangar on the base, which you can see right now, into the world's largest camera, a pinhole camera or camera obscura, if you will. And over almost 6 months of preparation to turn this into an airtight building where we could expose this picture, we made a picture, a photograph, a negative actually, if you will, that was 3 stories by 11 stories. It was developed in the hangar. We used 1,800 gallons of chemicals to develop and fix it. And the great picture went on world tour, went to China, went to 5 or 6 different locations in this country, including a 9-month stay at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. The next series that I started working on, and this is where my movement toward black and white started to happen. This was maybe about 5 years ago, and this new black and white journey started. I really have no idea why my mind shifted from color to black and white. I think maybe it was a meditative thing. Like I mentioned earlier, it might have had something to do with the nuances of black and white. But I also think it had more to do with the storytelling aspect. By using black and white, I could eliminate a lot of things from the picture, from the photograph that I really did not want to focus on. So in this series called LA Remembered or LA Icons, I grew up in Los Angeles, and as with many people who've lived there, there's a love-hate relationship with the city. And as with the desert series, I read an article one day in the paper about an iconic building in Los Angeles that was being torn down. And I decided that I should go look at some of these buildings, that maybe I could photographically preserve some of these iconic buildings before they were razed and turned into memory. So I started taking pictures. Here's, for example, is the theme building at the LAX International Airport. And so I started reducing the content of the image and that which is within the frame of the image so as to concentrate on the subject matter itself at hand without obstructions or diversions. Here, the images are isolated and appear to be floating in white, positive space. These buildings are recognizable, and that was the intent. I had printed these on their very small scale, and they're printed on watercolor paper to give them the appearance of a pencil drawing. And the reason for that is because many of these buildings were drifting off into memory, and I wanted to present in a two-dimensional scale that sort of drifting off into memory. And from this series, again, this is all within the last 4 or 5 years, I have another series called Woodblow. And in these, again, I've used architecture and buildings as a foundation, but these are isolated panoramas of buildings that I found interesting because I wanted the panoramic aspect. And I wanted the buildings to be floating in black space. And then thus the journey into negative space started to happen for me. By eliminating the backgrounds, we can concentrate on the building itself and the purity of the design. And then the last project I did, which is a book called The Deconstructed Odyssey. Again, using architecture as a base. This time I allowed my imagination to go completely wild. What you're looking at is a building stripped of absolutely everything superfluous, only left with a few design elements in place, which I have chosen, to try to create a completely different way of looking at things and to try to take buildings and abstract them as much as humanly possible. The effort was to remove the buildings as far as possible from reality and to construct these totally new abstractions, which would force the imagination to recreate the buildings, if you will. The complexity of things hidden under the guise of simplicity. As Saint-Antoine d'Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince, once said, the photographer knows when he's reached perfection, but not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Now we come to the show and case, and we come to 2020. And 2020 was a strange year for almost everybody. One of the things in my life that became sort of a more important thing that I had to deal with is that you reach a certain age, you've been collecting things all of your life. And I realized that now I have to take care, I'm maintaining that there was too much stuff, always too much stuff, and that my life needed to be simpler. And in my case, parenthetically, it was easier to create artwork about eliminating clutter than actually trying to clean out the garage or my closet. But then that's another story. Then COVID came a year ago, almost a year ago, and this forced us to look inward again. Again, more shots from the installation. As you can see, I've been trying to create a new way of seeing by stripping the images of all the noise, the chatter, the clutter, the excesses, all that is superfluous. By stripping away this clutter, it becomes easier to focus on the main elements rather than on the noise. In a way, by using buildings as a metaphor, I'm looking for the soul or essence around which the architect may have conceived of this building. As Marcel Proust once said, the real voyage to discovery consists not in seeking new landscape, but in having new eyes. Hymns to the Silence, more often than not, photographs are about something. Now, these are images that are in the book, but not in the show. I wanted to give you an idea of how these stripped down abstractions start to look. So these images, more often than not, are not about something. These images are about evoking an emotion or a spirit. They're not facts, they're suggestions. I'm creating a poem from the evidence, in this case, a building or a part of a building that may or may not have been overlooked. Some are recognizable as buildings, some, like this, are not. These architectural photographs may appear to be simple overall, but they include subtle details that balance simplicity and complexity. Embracing the negative spirit enriches this balance and ensures that one does not tire of the architecture in question, but constantly finds new meaning and enriched beauty that cause its aesthetic value to grow over the years. I'm influenced by a Japanese concept of ma, which is described as an emptiness full of possibilities, like a promise yet to be fulfilled, and has been described as the silence between the notes which makes music. The following poem by the Chinese philosopher and poet Lao Tse, written in the 6th century BC, illustrates this idea. 30 spokes meet in the hub, but the empty space between them is the essence of the wheel. Pots are formed from clay, but the empty space within it is the essence of the pot. And walls within windows and doors form a house, but the empty space within is the essence of the house. Our eyes rarely rest on emptiness. We seek out the subject so as to consume, to digest, to interpret, and even to manipulate. I'm asking the viewers to set aside these predispositions for consumption and order, and simply to rest. In these images, the emptiness is full of possibilities, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. I've always liked a country singer by the name of David Allan Coe, one of the old outlaws. And he wrote a song called The Ride, where he's a young musician going off to Nashville. He's hitchhiking to Nashville, as a matter of fact, and he's picked up by an old Hank Williams in an old Cadillac. And over the course of the ride, Hank Williams asked the young David Allan Coe about his aspirations to be a songwriter and a singer, and asks him one very important question, at least in my mind. And the question is, can you make folks feel the way you feel? At the end of the day, if a photograph makes you feel, then I've accomplished something grand. I still struggle with concepts and meaning because there are times when my photographs tend to explore an intellectual avenue, and these images seem to be devoid of feeling. But then the same could be said of the abstract expressionist, and yet when I look at their works stripped down to the bare essence, I still feel something. But to feel something, one must know how to slow down, to rest and reflect. This is the underlying intent of this series. In essence, the work is about the viewer because it is in the viewer's mind that he will experience the stillness, the viewer's soul that will hear the music and fill in the empty spaces. As a quick aside, how do I choose this or that building, or does it choose me somehow? So what I do is I do internet searches on buildings that are of interest, historical buildings, mid-century buildings, Bauhaus buildings. Since I live in Orange County, I look in Los Angeles, Orange County, San Diego, places that I can drive to. Once I've found some buildings that might be of interest, then I go to Google Earth and I try to look at the buildings more closely. I look at them from the sky, from the ground, from north, south, east, and west. When I've found some that are of interest to me, then I will map out 4 or 5 locations and go visit them. Usually shoot on a weekend where there are few people and less parking problems, and more COVID friendly, of course. Then I go to the building and I just walk and I look, and I walk and I look some more. I slow down, I take my time. I'm trying to find an angle or perspective that is not commonly seen, that is of interest. This piece, now we're starting the pieces that are actually in the show. This was the first piece that was taken in the series, and it's called the Taj Mahal. And this piece was taken a couple of years ago, whereas all the rest of them were taken within the last year. What drew me to this piece And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about, is what inspired me to the piece rather than identifying the location. You can do that on your own. Identifying the location, to me, puts an idea in your mind, whereas what I wanted to do is to have your mind free of the clutter so you can roam and make your own interpretations. What drew me to this picture was the repetition of these arches, the sort of feminine musicality of it, and then, of course, isolated in the black space. What I've done is eliminate all the disruptions, the sky, the trees, the cars, the people that might be in there, so that you can concentrate on the building itself. This piece, called Contemplation, is familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time, but it's still very recognizable as a building. Someone was looking at this one day and asked me, well, did you have a certain piece of art in mind when you did this? And I said, yes, absolutely. This piece right here by Rodin, the thinker. And he said, oh, good, that's exactly what I thought. And you see, in a way, there's a very similar shape to it. In this piece called Drifting into Eternity, now you've seen it is the side of a building if you want to look at it that way, but it is taken into a complete abstraction so that your mind can interpret exactly how it wants to do it. And I see this as a dance between the object as it was and what it has now become, a dance between the real and the abstract. And that, for me, is pure magic. This piece called Shul, what drew me to it was the repetition of the patterns of these sort of triangles, which is repeated down the center line exactly. You have the wings of an angel and archangel along the side. Again, the negative space on the bottom and the top, which tie the piece together. And I was told by someone that the triangular motif here is repeated throughout the inside of the building. This piece entitled Mitosis. Mitosis in biology is cell division, which gives rise to two identical cells. And in this piece, what I saw was this building divided, bifurcated, with the light shining heavily on the one side and the darkness and shadows on the other. But again, the repetition, the patterns, the perspective are all similar things that find themselves in all of these images. Stepping boldly. Well, now I'm thinking like a poet, which I was at one time. I spent a number of years writing poetry, and I think I have 4 books of poetry written. And it's because I think like a poet, and I find that poetry and photography are very closely related. Both are suggestive, both are fragmentary, both are reductive. And poetry, whether it's visual or written, is as much about what you leave out as what you leave in. The interpretations, again, are yours to make. Ostinato, which means a continually repeated musical phrase or rhythm. Now, this piece incorporates many of those principles found in poetry again: the repetition, the ambiguity, the negative space, the abstraction. Like an effective poem, these images capture the tension between form and function, between what is shown and what is concealed, between reality and aspiration. The mystery lies in what's suggested to the audience rather than what's explicitly said. Again, the repetition, the feminineness of this, it almost has a musical quality. These almost appear as if they're notes in a musical scheme. Infinitum, I guess for an obvious title, because it, again, the perspective draws you in, and the arches, which are imbalanced, repeat themselves over and over and over again. Again, with the wonderfully nuanced shades of gray and white and black, which are throughout. Hopefully this kind of pulls one in as a meditative factor. Tricolone, which is actually the same columns as this building here, but looking at it from a straight up angle. And the reflection that you see here is not water, but actually reflections of these concrete columns in glass. The drift. It's a staircase, a concrete staircase on a building. In this case, I'm going to show you a before and after. This is to give you an idea of what I use as a base in my picture, and then I take everything out that complicates the story for me. So I want to deal only with the concrete balcony, and so there it is, there's the finished product. Isos, which is short for isosceles. Obviously, this looks like a series of isosceles triangles all layered one upon another. What I like about this image is the organicness of the clouds and all the sky that are reflected in the glass. Again, shifting more and more to more abstractions. This is called eternal recurrence. This part of the building is pointing into space, again, with the repetition, the silence, and the mystery. What is it pointing to? Where is it drawing you to? It almost has a outer space type of quality to it. This piece has a French title, Un monde à l'envers, which means a world upside down, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. This breaks the rules of photography and most art, where you want the weight on the bottom of the piece to sort of act as a foundation. And here I've turned the whole thing upside down. Ascension. What drew me to this was the movement that I saw in this particular angle. It almost looked like a musical piece, a dance. It looked alive. It went from being two-dimensional to almost being three-dimensional, at least in my space. Intersection. Here is a very masculine piece, full of very sharp angles, repeated triangles over and over and over again. Ironically, this is a police headquarters in Los Angeles. Capolavara. What attracted me to this was the dark broodingness of it. It almost looked like a character out of a dark Gothic comic book or something. Almost had a human quality to it. Disruption. This is what it's not what the architects call the building, but I will tell you a little bit about this building. It's called the Vaspartan Restaurant, and it's in Culver City. It is a 5-story building, beautiful lines to beautiful abstractions. It's one of the most expensive restaurants around. It has a 2-star Michelin. Jonathan Gold named it the #1 restaurant in Los Angeles in 2017. And the piece is called Disruption because the chef who opened it wanted to create a disruptive dining experience. He wanted it to be unlike any restaurant that you had ever been to. And I'm just enthralled by the outside of the building. Nocte ac die in Latin, which means night and day. And what attracted me or drew me to this picture, obviously, was the contrast, the balancing act between the light and the dark, between good and evil. It was subtle, it's nuanced. And again, I like the balance. This piece is called Coatello Island. And needless to say that it is a part of a building designed by Frank Gehry. Intuition. This seems to me to be a meeting of the minds, an intersection of different realities. Again, somewhat organic. Scale in all these pieces is kind of thrown out the window, as is context. And that is in an effort to allow you, the viewer, to put your own interpretation into the work. The veil in the vault, this is called. And this is what the architects who designed this building called it, because it has the skin that you see hovers over a museum, a vault that has full of artwork and thus the interpretation, the veil in the vault. In summary, I'd like to quote from Douglas McCullough, who's a senior curator of the California Museum of Photography. Over the last few decades, he says, I have seen Garnier's desire to create abstractions becoming more and more radical. He has increasingly decided art should not deliver a report on reality, whatever that might be, but instead look at what is behind reality. The artist seeks to transcend the subject, essentially make subject matter irrelevant. These are reductive works, images that remove the superfluous. What remains finally is awareness itself, the bare viewer, consciousness of visual perception itself. Garnier is on an emotional quest, a spiritual journey. In the end, his project suggests that an even more dramatic purification is possible. The path is hinted at by Zen traditions and a summary comment by composer and artist John Cage. When you start working, everybody's in your studio, the past, your friends, enemies, the art world, and above all, your own ideas. All are there. But as you continue painting, they continue leaving one by one, and you are left completely alone. Then, if you're lucky, even you leave. Thank you.